Are you thinking of leaving corporate, but too afraid to make the move? Have you already escaped corporate, but are finding it hard to run your dream business? Are you wasting valuable time by attempting to figure challenges out on your own? We have created a podcast for corporate escapees running their own business. This is the Corporate Escapees Podcast by Build, Live, Give. We bring you first-hand experiences of guests going through many of the struggles you face each and every day as a corporate escapee. We get real with no corporate BS. And now, over to your host, Paul Higgins.
Welcome to the Corporate Escapees Stories by Build, Live, Give. I'm Paul Higgins and I'm your show host. And today I'm really excited to have Tom Sylvester from Sylvester Coaching and Training. Tom knew from a very early age that corporate was not going to be for him, but he needed to create some income before he left. So he set a plan that by age 35, he would leave and start his own entrepreneurial journey. So during this journey, he actually had a life-changing moment where he defied his wife and now business partner in making a really big bet. And what he realized from this is that it's really important to communicate with your partner, who also happens to be your life and business partner, that it's about the why you're doing something, not particularly the how you're doing it. So it's a really valuable lesson that he digs into. He also shares some brilliant insights into how to be an entrepreneur whilst having the family at the center of everything you do. And he also talks about how he manages and complements his wife, who's got a very different personality type to him. As I said, they're both partners in life and business. And Tom's also a lifelong learner, and he gives some great insights and some really practical example of how you can benefit from the learning. So it's a brilliant podcast. And what I'll do now is hand you over to Tom Sylvester from Sylvester Coaching and Training. I hope you're inspired by listening to our wonderful guest stories. All of our guests know the one ingredient to rapidly grow their dream business. That is picking the right suppliers. Let's face it, it's too hard doing it all on your own. So with this in mind, we have created a free on-demand training which gives you the 4 essential questions to ask suppliers. I've combined my 18 years experience at Coca-Cola and 7 years advising corporate escapees all over the world to give you actionable advice in less than 25 minutes. Simply go to buildlivegive.com/webinar. If you are tired of underachieving and want to fill gaps in skills, please watch our on-demand training now. The link will also be in the show notes. Please check it out. Welcome Tom Sylvester from Sylvester Coaching and Training to the Corporate Escapees podcast brought to you by Build, Live, Give. So we're going to get to know a lot about you today, Tom, but why don't we just start with something that your friends or family may know about you that our listeners wouldn't?
Okay, so with that, it's probably the fact that I'm this big history nerd. So for most people that know me from, my business or my corporate life, they know I'm always like a business guy. I'm always serious. So when they hear that I like just geek out on like any historical documentaries or like anytime, like my wife always gives me this, anytime we go visit somewhere, I got to like check out something historical there. So I'm just really big fan of history. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from history.
Yeah, and how do you consume it? What's some of the docos that you, or channels or ways that you get some of the information?
Yeah, a lot of it comes from documentaries. So, we have Netflix, so a lot of them come on there. Big fan of like World War II stuff. I think that was just a crazy time, for like, civilization, and just seeing all the different perspectives and all the things that led up to that and then came out of that. Just very interesting and, very scary in a lot of ways.
Yeah, look, I'm a bit like you. I love my docos. We've got a channel here in Australia called SBS, and every 7:30 every night they have a doco free to air. So I watch those, or I tape them and watch them. So I love it. And in 2016, we went to Europe, and you're definitely going through France and the UK and Germany, sort of getting different perspectives on World War II was brilliant. So we've definitely got that alike, and something else we've got alike is the fact that you've successfully escaped corporate to run your own business. So sort of tell me a little bit about your corporate escapee story.
Yeah, absolutely. So my wife and I actually met the very first day of college. And, we had 4 years of college together. And then so I went to school for computer science. And as we were getting ready to graduate, I kind of looked ahead and I was like, 45 years of sitting in a cubicle and like developing software. I was like, that's not the life that I want for us. And so at that point, I had no idea how I was going to make it happen. But I said, I'm going to plan my corporate escape. And I said, I'm going to retire by 35. So I had no idea how I was going to make that happen, but I set that out there. And basically, once we graduated, I just started looking for any way that I could escape even before I started. So I ended up finding a job as a software developer. And then on the side, I was like trying everything I could figure out to actually make it so I could leave. And so I tried the stock market. And then I realized that one, I didn't have a lot of money. And two, there's a lot that goes into that. And it didn't matter how many books I read, I just couldn't figure it out. And so then I went to MLMs and I just started looking at what other people that were successful did. And I came across real estate. And I was like, if we could start real estate investing, that could kind of start us on this path. And while I was off, trying to make all this stuff happen, my wife basically said no to every idea that I came up with. And so I got really demoralized because I was like, I don't want to work this job for the rest of my life. And so there was one night when I was driving home from work, it was like a late night. And I heard this ad on the radio basically say, come to this free training. You can learn how to be a real estate investor. And, it's only a couple passes left. And I was like, okay, this is it. I just need some training and I'll be able to do the real estate stuff and get my wife on board. So long story short, a lot of those trainings take you to a free training and then a more expensive one. And ultimately they had like this $15,000 training. And so I went with my cousin and we were ready to walk out. And then I had this little noise in the back of my head that was like, if you don't do this, you're not going to be able to ever escape. And so at that point, we decided to invest in the training. It was $7,500 each. I actually put it on 2 credit cards because we didn't have that kind of money. Right. And I did all of this without ever talking to my wife. And so at that point, when I told her, we had to really just have some conversations to say like, what's going on? Why would you spend all that money without talking to me? And then, we were about to get married in 9 months. So we had to really talk about what our futures look like and how we're going to kind of work together to make that future reality. So, fast forward from that, we ended up really getting aligned on what was important to us. And then nowadays, basically when my daughter was born about 6 years ago, my wife was able to leave her job. And then I spent a couple more years in corporate. And then ultimately, because we built up multiple businesses on the side, I was finally able to leave my job. And we both now work in our businesses full time.
Brilliant. Well, that's a great story. And for those people that, take that big decision without their partner, but knowing that they want to do the right thing by their partner, what advice have you got for them? Because obviously, you had that inspiration, you made that decision, and then you had to go back and talk to Ariana and I suppose get her across the board or across the line. What did you do? Like, take us to that moment and any advice you can give others, because I'm sure there's lots of other people that will either face that or will face that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the biggest thing that I always tell people is, talk to your partner and get aligned on, what goals you have for life, what you want your life to look like in the future, and make sure that you talk about why you want those things. So prior to that event, we actually had a lot of really good conversation, but a lot of times most of us don't look forward in the future and say, okay, what is important to us? What do we want to have in 10, 20, 30 years? And, how are we going to make it happen? And, when we had a lot of those conversations, which were very difficult, the one thing I figured out was that I kept telling her what I wanted to do. I wanted to invest in the stock market. I wanted to leave my job. I wanted to invest in real estate, but I never told her why. And it was that point when we started having the conversation about why, which for me at that point was so that we could build the lives that we wanted for our family. Then everything changed and it was like, okay, I get it. Now I see why you're so driven and so motivated. And so once we had that conversation and got aligned, then it became much easier to say, okay, what are the different options that we can use to get there? And then let's figure out what role we're each going to play to make sure that we build that lives that we want. So it's really around making sure that you're aligned and you're having that open communication. And, if your spouse isn't on board, it's so much better to take a step back and say, okay, what's going on? Like, why is this a fear for you? And let's dive in and understand rather than just trying to push it forward. Because if you don't have their support, it's going to make everything else so much more difficult.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice. And so when was your last day in corporate? What year was that?
So it was last year, and I was 33, so I beat the goal by 2 years.
Excellent. Well, that was going to be my next question. So well done. And when you finally took that step, was what was sort of the fears at the time? I know it's only 12 months ago. What were some of the key fears you had when you finally took that step?
Yeah. So, basically my corporate career went from a software developer, and then I ended up really getting into like productivity and helping software development teams and then product development teams develop products faster, make more profitable products. And so I ended up shifting from a corporate job into corporate consulting for several years. And so while I was doing that, I was picking up a lot of really good skills around like leadership and business strategy. And I was really learning from a lot of different companies, and a lot of really good leaders. So I knew that when, we would finally switch and I would be full time, that I could use those skills. The big fear and concern I had was that I had built up a pretty good income. And even when we left, there was going to be expenses like our health insurance ended up being over $1,000 a month because we have 2 kids. And, it was like everyone around us, even though we had multiple businesses and we were making, pretty good income from those, everyone around us was like, is this really responsible? Your wife stays home. You're now going to leave. Like, how are you guys going to make money? You've got 2 kids. So even though I knew we were making enough money and things would be fine, there was kind of that thought in the back of the head is, am I being an irresponsible father? Am I being an irresponsible husband by putting my needs of wanting to leave and make a bigger impact with our businesses ahead of, what's best for my family?
Great. And those learnings, so, as you said, you were getting paid to learn, I suppose, by consulting to so many businesses. If you just had to sort of pick out a couple of key themes that you'd love to pass on to the corporate escapees listeners, what would they be? What are some of the key themes you learnt whilst doing that consulting?
Yeah, a couple things. So one, and we've worked with a lot of people and we've helped a lot of people leave since then. One of the biggest things is I found a lot of people that want to leave a corporate job view that corporate job as like getting in the way of their dreams. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it because it kind of pins our job against our business, which isn't really the case. The reality is your job is actually enabling you to be able to build your business. So from that job, you're getting a paycheck so that you don't have to worry about how are you going to feed your family or are they going to be taken care of. You're picking up valuable skills in how to organize your time, in how to work with others, in how to communicate. So there's a lot of benefit to being in your job. And, one of the biggest things that I always tell people is don't leave too soon. When we help people leave, we actually help them map out their runway. We take a look at their money coming in, money going out, and we lay out the different scenarios for them. Because I think one of the most unfortunate things is when I see somebody leave too soon and they haven't built up enough runway or enough income from their business, and then they have to go back to a job. And at that point, they're typically a little bit demoralized. They're a little bit embarrassed. They've blown through a lot of their money. Their spouse may not trust them. So realize that a job is actually enabling you to build that business. It's not taking away from it.
Excellent. And as far as help, you sort of mentioned, learning from others, but what other help did you get to help you along this journey to sort of, build that nest egg and then leave at 33?
Yeah, one of the habits that I picked up even before I left college was realizing that I needed to be this lifelong learner. And it wasn't just about learning, but it was also about implementing. So prior to that, I actually hated reading books. I would do everything I could to avoid it. And once I kind of figured out I needed to be that lifelong learner, I started reading a lot of books and I started listening to podcasts. And I actually went back to grad school and got my master's in business management. And so every time I would learn something, I would basically try to implement it that next day. And by doing that, it made me really fail a lot, but I failed quick and I learned so much. So I would learn more in, say, 1 year than a lot of people would learn in maybe 5 years. So I really figured out how to really take that new information in, test it out, figure out how to get past failure and keep moving on. And those are really key traits of successful entrepreneurs, because this journey is difficult and you're going to run into a lot of failures. So the sooner you can figure out how to mentally be that entrepreneur that's going to be successful and start acting that way, the sooner you're going to be able to do the right things to let you live that life you want.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. And just take us to a practical example. So you learn something on a podcast, in a book, and then the next day you go and implement it. How do you actually make that happen? Like, what's your process for making that happen?
Yeah, one of my favorite things is we're big fans of time blocking on our calendar. So if you look at my calendar, mine and my wife's, we actually have like 12 different calendars, and I schedule out basically every hour of my day. And it sounds a little crazy, but what that allows me to do is be very clear on when I'm doing certain things, and I make habits out of it. So every morning from 6 to 7 in the morning, I have for learning time. So I'll be reading a book that will help me with the next thing I got to do in business. So for example, let's say I'm reading a book on how to improve my sales. I'll read a chapter or two in that book, and then I'll take something out of there like, oh, maybe if you try this script or this wording on your next sales call, you'll be able to increase your closing rate. So I'll try that out for that day or maybe for a week, and then I'll check back in and say, did that increase or did that decrease? And then I'll learn from that and then make adjustments based on what was working and what wasn't.
Excellent. I wrote down here, learn, action, and then adjust. So I think that's a nice loop that you've got. And I love the fact that you've sort of embedded it into your habits. So the next section is around the build section. So if you walk into a party or a networking event and someone says, so Tom, what do you do? How do you answer that?
So I say, my wife and I are entrepreneurs. We own multiple businesses, but our main focus these days is actually working with other entrepreneurs with families. We help them build more profitable businesses so that they can get some of their time back and build the life that they love.
Great. And I'm assuming most people say, well, how do you do that, Tom? And how do you answer that?
Exactly. So we let them know that when we work with people, the first step is really figuring out what is it that they want out of life, because we find too many people try to start a business, but they're not sure why they're building that business. So we help them figure out what that is. And then we really walk through what's getting in the way. Like, where are they at today? Where do they want to go? And what's getting in the way? And one of the analogies I often use with people is it's like GPS. So if you know where you're at today, and you know where you want your life to look like, we can then basically map out a plan to help get you there. And then we can figure out what type of business, we can kind of model that out and say, what size business, what does it kind of have to look like to enable that life that you want? And so once we build that plan out, then we can set up a process so that you're working on that plan, but then you're checking in and reviewing along the way, just like GPS would. So if you get a little bit off track, you can check in and say, oh, I'm off track. I got to make an adjustment to get back on. And that way you're not getting too far off track before you realize that you're actually on the wrong path.
Great. And you said, entrepreneurs that are family orientated, but how did you get to that? How did you decide who your ideal client is?
Yeah, it's funny. So we actually, our first business was real estate investing. And then a couple of years later, we started a wine and liquor store. So with those first two businesses, it was pretty clear on who we were going to work with. So it didn't take a lot of time to figure out our ideal client. But as we had a lot of different people coming up to us to help them start a business, we really didn't think about the ideal client. We were just working with them. And very quickly, we found out that there were certain people that we liked to work with and certain ones that we didn't. But it actually took a lot longer than we thought to figure out who our ideal client was. And what actually made it clear for us was we sat down and we wrote out a manifesto. And in that manifesto, we wrote our core values, what we believed in, who we thought we could help, and the result that we thought we could get them. And once we wrote that out, it became very clear that we wanted to help people like us. We wanted to help people that had families and people that were building their businesses for their families.
Great. And are there any particular sort of industries or verticals, Tom, that your clients are in?
So no specific industries. We tend to work with entrepreneurs that are, I would say, small businesses. Usually they have anywhere from 1 to 10 employees. And a lot of what we end up helping them with is they've had a certain amount of success. And then when they kind of get stuck and they've got to level up to that next level of growing their business and they're not sure how to do that, that's a lot of where we'll step in and help them to do some of the strategy around their business, help them really set the goals, and then help them with hiring and putting the systems in place and looking at the financials and kind of doing all the things that you should do as a business owner. And then helping them also grow as a leader, because what a lot of people don't realize is as your business grows, it also requires a lot of personal development. And so we've been on that journey and on that path multiple times with different businesses. So we're able to kind of help them navigate not only growing as the business, but how do they make sure that as their business grows, it doesn't take over their life.
Yeah. And what are some of the biggest pain points you see in that inflection point where people really start to grow? What are some of the most common pain points you see?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is when they get to the point where they're working a lot and they can't physically work anymore. They can't physically grow the business because they're like a solopreneur. It's them at the middle of everything. And so we end up helping them to figure out what the business has to look like for them to continue to grow. And oftentimes that means removing them from certain parts of it and then putting processes and procedures in place and hiring other people and putting systems or standard operating procedures in place. Now, for most people, when they've done everything and they feel like, they've got to be there, it's tough to say, okay, I'm now going to lead this business. I'm going to hire people in, maybe I've never hired before. And then I'm going to now be responsible for those people in, helping them to be the best. And then so that can build the business. So one is the business piece of that, of how does the business have to look? But then two, it often takes work with the entrepreneur to say, this is good. This is the role that you got to step in to be the leader of that business. And it's going to be uncomfortable, but we'll work you through it.
Yeah. And is there any particular platforms or any methodology you use to help people, improve their systems and processes?
Yeah, so lean is basically the foundation that we use for everything. So when I was in corporate, if people aren't familiar with lean, essentially it is mapping out all of your processes, and oftentimes it's visual. And then what you're looking for is every process either has steps that are valuable and steps that are wasteful. And what happens most times is that we get these processes that are mostly waste and not a lot of value. So what we do with everybody that we work with is we help map out all their processes. We look at how they make money and where the bottlenecks are in those processes. And we work to remove the bottlenecks and then remove any steps that aren't directly delivering value. And so oftentimes what a lot of entrepreneurs are surprised with is that even without spending more money or more time, they can actually be a lot more productive because we get rid of a lot of the stuff that ends up, taking time and money, but doesn't deliver value to them.
And is there any particular place to start? Like, I know for a lot of people listening to this podcast, they've come from corporate, so they've had really good processes, but they sort of love the freedom of not having them when they run their own business, and that's one of the benefits. And then all of a sudden they think, okay, I need to go back and create some. From your experience, where's a great place to start that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because oftentimes people look at, leaving corporate, it's like, well, I'm my own boss and I can kind of do anything that I want. And they, the phrase is like, throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's what a lot of people do. They throw away all the good habits and good skills that they picked up with leaving the job. And then they realize pretty quickly that some of those processes and procedures and even how their day was structured was actually helping them. So one of the best things that we tell people to do is every week, put an hour aside and reflect on the week and plan out the next week. So my wife and I do this every week for all of our businesses plus our personal life. And in this meeting, we do a couple things. First, we look back on the week and say, what went well, what didn't go well, and then based on that, what's one or two improvements that we can make next week to have more things that go well and less things that don't go well. And that reflection lets us kind of check in on the business and always work on making something better. And then we plan out the next week so that when we go into the next week, we know what our focus is. We've already got essentially the week laid out, and then we can just focus on executing and doing what we need to do instead of trying to figure out what's next. this shiny object that comes in, should I worry about that? So that really just helps kind of set that 1 week pace and then make sure that we're always improving compared to the previous week.
Yeah, I like that, and it's a journey rather than, I think some people try to eat the elephant all at once. That I'll just go from no processes to all my processes. So they'll either do that unsuccessfully or be paralyzed by that. I know often people will say, "I'm just not ready. I'm too busy." I'm like, well, to your point, blocking time and working on one thing at a time, and if it is into those weekly buckets like a sprint, I think is really valuable. So great advice there. And as far as your business model, so from the coaching side of it, how do you gain revenue? Like what's the way that you charge your clients?
Yeah, so early on, the model was purely one-on-one coaching. And then over time, we listened to a lot of our clients and people that didn't become clients and started adding in additional revenue streams. So we now have a low-cost monthly mentorship that really guides people who are early on in the journey, but not quite ready to invest in coaching. And then we have multiple coaching programs. We make a little bit of money from affiliate income. And then we're actually launching a handful of new trainings and digital products this year that are basically the same exact things that we do to our coaching clients, but more of a DIY version so that, people can run through them on their own if they don't necessarily want to invest in a coach.
Great. And I know there's a lot of brilliant coaches and communities out there, but what sort of sets you guys apart? Why would people work with you versus others?
Yeah, great question. For us, it's really the fact that we're a couple and, we're not just partners in business, but we're partners in life. And the big thing I think that really sets us apart is the fact that my wife and I are completely opposite. So I'm the visionary, the big picture thinker. I'm like the natural entrepreneur. And she used to call herself the reality checker because she wasn't on board with any of this. And whenever I would have an idea, she's like, all right, let's pull it back to reality. So, she's more of like the detailed person, make sure nothing drops off. And so like when people listen to us on the podcast or when they meet us, normally they'll gravitate to one of us or the other. So oftentimes, if you're looking to hire a coach or you're working with somebody, you might only get one perspective. And what's cool with us is that you get two perspectives from both the business side and then also the life side.
Excellent, excellent. I love that yin and yang. I think that's a
Yeah.
great combination.
Yep.
And for your own business and the coaching side, like how long did it take for you to become profitable?
So the good thing about that business was we were profitable, I think, basically within the first month. And essentially that's because this business was a service-based business. And I'll often tell people that's a good way to start if you've got skills in a certain area because it's very low startup cost and you're not really spending that much money. And once you get that first client, you're going to be profitable. So oftentimes, if you start a service business, you can get paid to work with clients, plus to really learn and do a lot of that market research. And then from there, you can figure out, okay, what products or other things can I offer that don't necessarily require my time to be exchanged?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way where you do start that consulting, then your pyramid up like you have with all of those different options. And as far as a new business and particularly into the coaching business, how do you get new leads?
So these days, most of our leads actually come from existing clients, people that have worked with us in one way or another, or people that have or know us but aren't necessarily clients. So we get a lot of referrals in these days. Back before that, it was kind of hit or miss. We really didn't have a solid way to bring new people in. And part of that was because we weren't actually clear on who our avatar was. So we were initially just going after any entrepreneurs. And once we honed in on our avatar, now like we've got our podcast, it's called Lifestyle Builders. So that name in itself starts to draw people in. And then from our podcast and from our blog posts and a lot of the stuff we put out there, now we're starting to bring more people in because they're seeing our messaging and jiving with it and then want to work with us.
Excellent. And we'll definitely, that and other links that you've mentioned, we'll have in the show notes. And as far as a lot of referrals, what's sort of the best way for you to convert those? You do them, through a webinar, through one-on-one calls. What's sort of your sales funnel, so to speak?
Yeah, so usually what we'll do is we'll send people to a survey, and that'll help them fill out some information about themselves personally, some of their ambitions, where they're at today, and where they want to go. And so from that, we'll make sure that we understand, who's kind of a good fit. If we don't think they're going to be a good fit to work with us, we'll let them know. But most of the time, we'll get people on a call, and we'll do a free discovery call, really just to dive in and understand, am I a right fit for you? Or are we a right fit for you? Are you a right fit for us? And there's really like two questions that I'll usually ask at the beginning that will likely tell me if we're going to be a good fit. And the first one is, like, why now? Why is now the time you decided that you're going to invest in yourself, invest in a coach? And then why us? And from those two questions, usually we can figure out, one, are they ready to actually commit and do the work that's required to be successful? And then two, are they seeking us because of our unique proposition, or are they just seeking us for another reason? And then so based on that, then we'll go through the rest of the call. And usually the ones that end up staying on become clients because we figured out it's a good fit.
Great. And I know you've sort of got multiple businesses, but what does your team look like for all of those businesses?
Yep. So the first business, real estate investing, we got a pretty small team. My father and I are partnered on that. And then we've got somebody that helps us with some of the administrative stuff. Our wine and liquor store, we've got 6 employees. One of them's the main, basically, manager. He does all the ordering and the supervision. And then for our coaching business, it's pretty lean. We've got a couple contractors to help us with some of the administrative stuff. But at this point, there's really not a ton of work to do outside of really just coaching people. So we keep that business pretty lean, and that helps a lot with the profitability.
Great. And obviously, I'm assuming these people are in different locations. Just how do you help manage a team that I suppose are dispersed, that they're not all in the one location?
Yeah, well, the beautiful thing today is that with the internet and with the advancement in technology, it's actually not too different than managing a team physically. When I was doing a lot of the corporate consulting, we ran into that a lot. And what we found was that, first off, it comes down to hiring the right people. And that really means getting clear on your values and the culture that you have for your company, and then hiring people that align with that. And then once you hire the right people, it's really about setting the right expectations, both what you expect of them and then what they expect of you. And then once you've got those expectations set, you say, how are we going to check in? And then how are we going to talk if things get off a little bit? So by laying all that out at the beginning, it then makes it so much easier to give feedback and have conversations when things don't go well. But in terms of people being dispersed, I mean, we use a lot of video conference calls. So like Zoom is a big thing for us. We use like Trello to manage a lot of our tasks and things that people got to do. And then we use Slack for communication between all the team members. So between those couple of tools and then just meeting periodically and having that consistent weekly review, that lets us work pretty well together, even though everyone's dispersed.
Brilliant. And what are sort of the key agenda items that you'd have in that weekly review? Just give us a bit of an insight into that.
Yep. So a lot of it is reflecting on the previous week. And I think we talked about that a little bit before. What went well, what didn't go well, and then what couple actions do we want to take for next week. We then also review how we're progressing on our goals and some of our KPIs, our key performance indicators. So we have a very simple dashboard that shows us basically, if we want to achieve these goals, what are the key actions that we got to be doing every week that will likely get us there? And then we look at those measures. And once we got all of that figured out, then we look ahead at the next week and say, okay, based on all of that, now what do we got to do in the next week and kind of who's doing what to make sure that we're still progressing towards those goals?
Great. And what's sort of the biggest challenge that you have at the moment, whether it's across all 3 businesses or whether it's in particular your coaching business?
So we've gotten a lot better at this over time, but as I said earlier, my wife and I are very different. And so one of the biggest challenges that we still continue to have is that when we have these different ideas, to really have the conversations and say, okay, what are we ultimately going to agree on of where we're going to go? So for example, one of the activities that we go through every year is really looking ahead at the future and saying, is our vision still correct? And then what are our short, medium, and long-term goals? And oftentimes we'll agree on our short-term goals. We'll get a little further off on the medium, and then the long term might start to divide. So we have to spend quite a bit of time saying, how big do we want to grow this business? Who do we really want to be working with? Does that look the same as we scale the business up? And then just what are some of the key things that we're going to focus on? So we found that, one, doing the weekly meetings help. But then we also do a meeting and a review every 90 days so that we can reset goals and make adjustments. And then once a year, we'll do kind of a bigger picture meeting where we look at all of that. So, it's really, one, making sure we're on the same page, but then two, checking in and adjusting because things always change.
And the next section's around the live section. So just, and you've covered some of these things already, but what are some of the daily habits that help you be really successful?
Yeah. So like I said, we've got like 12 different calendars. And when people first hear about that, they're like, oh my gosh, that sounds crazy. But it actually frees up a lot for us. So I have a calendar. My wife has a calendar. Each of our two kids have calendars. And then we've got a calendar for each business. And then we've got a couple other ones just to like block time. And so what we do as part of that weekly meeting is the first thing we sit down and do is say, okay, for our family stuff, our personal stuff, let's put that on the calendar. So my wife participates in choir. Our kids have like gymnastics and some other stuff going on. We have time for hobbies. We have time for our, we do like day dates because we can. And so we'll put that on the calendar first, and then we'll kind of weave our business stuff in between that. And so what that allows us to do is truly build the businesses that support the life that we want and make sure that we're kind of getting everything done and they're all supporting each other. So without that, like our week would be chaos because there's no way that we can manage our businesses, our kids, and everything else without kind of having that alignment.
Excellent. And that probably leads really nicely into the next question is, what 12 months, so I know 12 months since you've been fully into the coaching business, what's something you can do this year that you wouldn't be able to do if you're still in corporate or doing that consulting gig?
Oh, yeah. So the biggest thing, my daughter started kindergarten last year. And so one of the things I always said was I wanted to be able to take her to school and like be there when she goes to school and when she gets home. Because when I was doing the corporate consulting, I was actually traveling 4 days a week to a different city. And so that was really hard on me, being like really family focused, but having to be away from my family because I was working this job to support them. And so now, when my daughter has parents come in for like a field trip on Tuesday at 10 o'clock, I can do that. When other stuff comes up that requires me to be a dad, I have the flexibility of being able to do that first and not having to worry about, do I have enough vacation time? And, am I okay to leave, or is my boss going to tell me no? So just having that ability to truly put our family first has been the biggest thing that I wasn't able to do when I had a job.
Brilliant. And I know you've spoken quite a bit about Ariana and how important she is to this great partnership you've got. If she listens to this, well, when she does listen to this podcast, what would you love to say to her about the support she's given you?
You are amazing because I am, as I said, I'm a visionary thinker. I'm a big picture guy. But also, like, if you look at some of my personality profiles, I'm also a quick start. So I'll have a big picture vision. And like I said earlier, when I learn something, I go and implement it and then I learn from it. So that works out really well as an entrepreneur. It works out really terrible as a husband, especially when your wife is a complete opposite. So, it hasn't been easy, being married to me and kind of going through all the stuff that we've done, but she's been awesome at being open throughout it. Even when we disagreed on things, we've been able to have conversations, and like our relationship is so much stronger now because we had to go through a lot of those trials and tribulations.
And the next section's the give section. And what's a cause or a community that you're really passionate about and why?
Yeah. So one of our big visions, the first one was obviously to build this life for our family. But then the second one, the impact goal that we've always had, is to really introduce and further educate the younger generation on entrepreneurship and the fact that there's a different path than what most of us consider as going to like high school, going to college, working a job for 45 years, and then retiring. And, the big reason why that's important to us is we were strapped with a lot of student loans early on. Like my wife went to school for zoology because everyone told her, go to school for what you love. And so she ended up graduating college with like $60,000 in student loans, and she couldn't find a job. And so I ended up graduating with student loans as well. So we had like $70,000 or $80,000 in student loans. And when you start your life out already in that big of a hole, it is so difficult to get out of. And so what we want to do is really just educate kids to say, there are other options out there. And it's not to say that entrepreneurship is for everybody, but we believe it's important for the younger generation to at least know what options are out there so they can make a conscious decision on what's right for them and what's right for their lives.
Great. And look, the last section is the action section, and that's where you just give some rapid fire response answers to these questions. So the first one is, what's your top 3 productivity tips?
Number 1, get clear on where you want to be. Number 2, make sure that you're doing goal planning and kind of checking in on the key steps to get you there. And then number 3 is never stop learning. Always make sure that you're learning, but you're doing it intentional to get you to the next step on your journey.
Excellent. What are some, I know you mentioned, Slack, Trello, and Zoom, but what are some other apps that you love either on your phone or your desktop?
One of the biggest ones that I use with a lot of students is Voxer. So it's a messaging app, but it's also kind of like this walkie-talkie app. And what's nice with that is when I'm working with students, I can make sure that I'm there to support them. It doesn't matter what time of day it is. And that way, they're not kind of held up if they need something quick. So we'll typically do like weekly coaching calls, but sometimes they just need a quick piece of advice. And that's something where I can pull my phone out, give them a quick piece of advice, and then they can move on.
Great. And I know you talked about docos and your love for history, but what are some podcasts and books that you would recommend and why?
So ironically, I actually don't listen to a lot of podcasts anymore, even though we have one. What I've found is that as you level up in business, oftentimes you tend to get less and less from some of that static information, and you get more from being around other entrepreneurs. But with that said, a couple of ones that I listened to early on, Bigger Pockets was a really good one for real estate investing. Smart Passive Income with Pat Flynn is really good for getting people into like online business. And Entrepreneur on Fire is a really good one too with John Lee Dumas, where he just talks to so many different entrepreneurs and kind of walks through their journey.
Yeah, and we were fortunate enough to have Kate, John's partner, on the show the other day. So that's a great episode. I think it's episode number 51. If not, it's thereabouts. 51 or 52 is Kate, and she really gives you a great insight into behind the scenes of Entrepreneur on Fire. And
I was going to say, we were just hanging out with John and Kate about 2 weeks ago, and Kate and I share this affinity for like Scrum and systems. So every time we get together, we just geek out on like all that stuff, and they do it so well with their business. Like it's amazing to see.
Yeah, spot on. So definitely check that out. And some parting advice. What's some parting advice you'd love to leave the Build, Live, Give audience?
So given that we're talking about leaving a job, one of the biggest things that we tell people is the ideal scenario for leaving your job is you've built your business income up beyond what your expenses are going to be when you leave the job. And then it really isn't a lot of risk to leave because you're already in a good spot. But if you're not there and you really do want to leave early, what we recommend people do is really look at your runway. So your runway is basically going to be, if you leave the job, how many months do you have to make your business work before you're out of money? And so essentially what you're looking at is how much savings you have built up, and then how much you're going to have to spend out of that savings each month to make up the gap in your income. So a lot of people don't take the time to figure that out. But if you take just a little bit of time to calculate that, you can make a smart decision on when you leave your job. And then you'll also know how much time do you have to ultimately make that business work for you.
Brilliant advice. And I know you can find out more about Tom and Ariana at tomandariana.com/CE, and we'll put a link to that and also all the other brilliant information that Tom's shared. And a quick shout out also to Josh and Jill Stanton, that one have recently had a baby, a little baby boy, but also were kind enough to refer Tom to our podcast. So a quick shout out to them. But Tom, it's been brilliant talking to you. I think what you're doing certainly is adding enormous value to entrepreneurs, and I know a lot of people in our community would also love to find out more. I think that lovely balance of having a couple of businesses adding value back whilst you're really, the family is at the center of everything you do, I think is inspiring. So well done, and great to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I love what you're doing with the show. I think just being able to hear all the different ways that people have left corporate and all the lessons that they've learned make it so much easier for other people that want to do the same thing.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks, Tom. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Corporate Escapees podcast, brought to you by the team at Build, Live, Give. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it with other corporate escapees. If you would like to join a community of like-minded peers, please visit www.buildlivegive.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.